Hello, I'm Carolyn Judge and welcome to my tutorial on how to paint a realistic portrait in watercolour. This tutorial assumes that you've watched hopefully two of my previous tutorials. The first one is an introductory tutorial. It covers off the materials that I use, my methodology, how to work with reference photographs, really just how to get started on a watercolour painting. It's got lots of really good tips in it, and it's on YouTube if you Google my name, Carolyn Judge. Also there's a link to it on my website, carolynjudge.com. So I hope that you'll have a look at that. The materials I use are important. They really do determine largely the results that you get. If you work with materials that are different to mine, you might get different results. The other tutorial that's worth watching as a precursor to this portrait is how to paint an apple. If you can paint a good realistic apple, then you'll be able to paint a portrait of a person. Portraiture is all about creating form, shape, painting in tones, darks and lights, leaving highlights. How to identify that something is round in shape. There's lots of ways of doing that, and my apple tutorial will show how to create form, how to leave highlights, and how to build layers one after another using transparent watercolors. It's all the same methodology that we're going to use for this portrait. There'll be some variations to that methodology over the years. As I've gained experience in watercolour, probably 14 years of full-time painting now, I've learned different ways of working with watercolour, and I'll share a lot of those tricks and tips with you as we work through this portrait tutorial. It's of a friend of ours. His name is Woody. This is a photograph that my husband took of Woody. The methodology that I'm going to show you in this tutorial you can use for any portrait photograph. And if you specifically want to paint along to this portrait of Woody, I'd be happy to send you a copy of the photograph if you contact me through my contact page on my website. If you're going to use a different photograph, there's a few things that I'd say about a photograph, a reference photograph of portraiture. My husband took the photograph with the sun coming down on the side of his face. So on this side there's a lot of sunlight, and on this side there's a lot of shadow, and it's these shadows that are going to help us suggest that, for example, the nose sits forward of the face. And then of course we've got all this lovely shadow down here that's being cast by the sun as well. If you're going to work from your own photograph, try to make sure that there's some shadows in there. In my introductory video I describe how to make a drawing. If you choose to do a drawing, I'd say try and do a good drawing. Some people are very good at drawing. They don't need to stress too much about how to get their drawing onto watercolour paper. But if painting a portrait is going to be difficult for you, what I would recommend is that you use transfer paper from your reference photograph. I used 60 GSM transfer paper over this beautiful photograph that I actually got professionally printed off because I wanted a really good image and I wanted really good colours in it. And then I used this 60 GSM paper over the top. I've picked up all the detail of Woody's face, not just the outline and the placement of his features, but I've also picked up everything that I could possibly think of. I've picked up wrinkles, shadows, highlights. Every little bit of detail is drawn on here. This detailed drawing is going to help me throughout my whole portrait If I lose my pencil lines, it will show me how to place those features again. So I've already got my drawing ready to go on my watercolour paper. I'm using 600 GSM. You can tell it's very card-like. This is cold press Arches paper. It's beautiful paper. Doesn't need to be stretched because it's so thick. 600 GSM is 300-pound paper. If you don't want to use paper that thick, then you'll need to stretch your watercolour paper first. The reason why I love working on 600 GSM is because it holds so much water, and it means I can work far more in each wet layer. Before starting on the actual painting, there's a few things to think about. The first one is the pencil lines that you've made for your drawing. You want your pencil lines to be noticeable, but not too dark. Once we start putting water onto our watercolour paper, those pencil lines will get embedded into the fibres of the paper, and you'll never be able to get rid of them. And that can be a bit unsightly in a portrait. So I recommend light pencil lines, and if you end up washing them out altogether, well, you can just refer back to your original transfer image and redraw them in at any stage once you've got dry paper. The pencil that you use for your watercolour painting, it isn't terribly important, but if you use a very light pencil, you might have to press a little bit harder, and that might score the paper. You don't want that. You don't want to ever score your watercolour paper, because watercolour pigment will pool in that score. I just use one of these pencils. I quite like it because it's always quite blunt, so it's never got a very sharp end. But don't worry too much about the pencil. The important thing is to get a nice accurate drawing, especially with portraiture. Make sure all the features are in the right place. Another thing to consider before you start your painting is how accurate to the photograph are you going to make your portrait. Is your photograph simply going to represent the person, and then you're going to use your own artistic license to interpret as you paint? Or are you going to try to paint very much as per the photograph? For me, I want to emulate the photograph quite a lot. I'm going to use my artistic license to not pick up every single wrinkle, every single skin blemish. I always use my own judgment whenever I'm painting a portrait as to what areas I want to add and which areas I want to take out. I don't believe in airbrushing a portrait. I just portrait for the person that he is. I want to capture his character, and so I'm going to paint it quite realistically. The other thing to consider before you start painting the portrait itself is what is going to be your background. Leaving white paper is a possibility, but that's not something that I would want to do. This photograph has a very dark background. It was taken with trees in the background, but we purposely wanted to get the focus on Woody's face and make the background very abstract so that he stands out. He is the subject. Of course, I could paint some trees in, I could paint some sky in, I could paint anything into the background, but I don't want to. I actually want to paint just an abstract background and make Woody's face the subject without any distraction. I'm going to start off painting some yellow tones into my background. If I was going to end up with a blue or a purple background, I wouldn't do that because yellow doesn't work well under those two colours. But I'm probably going to go for a warm background. I may end up making it a greenish background as per the photograph. Putting in yellow tones at this stage gets rid of all that white paper. I don't want all that whiteness there as I'm working on my portrait. and it also creates some warm tones as underlayers for whatever my background is going to end up being. I'm going to explain as I go that I'm going to make my background blend into my portrait. This is important. If you work solidly on your background and then solidly on your portrait as two different painting subjects, you can end up getting an Arabic gum build-up between the outline of the portrait and the background as you keep building more and more layers. And I don't want that. I want softness between my portrait and my background. So I'm going to show you how to pull your background into your portrait, and then how to wash your portrait out into your background as we work through this tutorial. It will become clear. I've left lots of space around his image. This is the full size here. How I determine the size of a portrait, there's a lot of detail inside a portrait, so you don't really want to work on it as a small painting, and I don't think a very, very big portrait necessarily works. So I try and make the image fairly life-size. So A3 for me works very well. I often like to get the shoulders into the image as well. So I think we're just about ready to get started. Start working on our background first. I'm ready to start my realistic portrait of Woody. Here's the photo of him. I've got my drawing ready to go. I've rubbed out very lightly some of the harsh pencil lines, and I feel like I'm ready to get started. So with this Mandalay 2-inch brush, I'm just going to wet the whole sheet of paper. And the first step here is to put some paint down on the background. So I'm painting right over the portrait, right up to the edges. And what you want here is a nice even layer of water. So I've got a fairly even layer of water there, and while that's just soaking in, I'm just going to mix up my yellow. I'm filming this video with a wide-angled lens to incorporate the photograph and my palette. So making a bit of a puddle of water here, and then I'm just going to pick up some Whirlin yellow. That's a Daniel Smith yellow. It's a lovely fresh yellow. I don't think it's particularly warm or cool. I think it's just in the middle. Very versatile colour. And then I'm also just going to pick up some warmer yellow, some Indian yellow. My paper is still quite wet, so what I'm going to do now is wet it again, but this time I'm not going to wet into the portrait. My watercolour paint is going to travel into my portrait, and I'm not going to worry about that too much. Yellow is a tone that can go under the whole portrait, and I will be specifically working yellow as an underlayer, but for now I'm just trying to get a nice even layer of water to start dropping some background colour on. I'm actually going to just drop that yellow background colour on with this brush, and I'm just going to go for a reasonably abstract background. The only thing I want to retain on the portrait are the highlights. I've got quite a lot of water on my paper at the moment. I'm just going to move these yellows around a little bit, working with a very large brush here. And when you work with a very large brush, you end up with very wet paper and lots of pigment. So I'm just gonna make sure that the pigment doesn't touch the highlights in the portrait. And while that's being absorbed, the paper is still very wet. I can work on this paper until the shine starts to leave it. And I'll just drop in a bit more of the paler yellow, the Carolyn yellow. And I've now dried that big 2-inch brush off, so I'm just using the smaller brush. I'm really not very fussy about the background at this stage. You can see that the Indian yellow has run into the hairline here. I'm just going to dry this brush off and then move that out. I try to never touch my paper with kitchen towel or a cloth, because it really does affect the tension on the watercolor paper. And what you don't want is for some areas of the paper to be dry and others to be wet, because this water moves the pigment, and when it comes up against a dry area it will stop, and that creates a hard line, and you don't want that. So I'm just gonna rinse my brush, dry it off a little bit, and I'm just gonna lift that out. And this is I'm not really not too fussy about it, but as I do this, I'm making this paper drier than it was before, but I'm not drying it out. And the fact that there's some yellow on his ear here, it really doesn't matter, because that's all going to get built up with yellow tones. Now, something to note, and I'm being fussy about explaining this particular layer of paint, because our subsequent layers are going to be a repeat of this. And something to observe is that down in this corner I've got a bit of a puddle forming, and I'm just going to put this piece of kitchen towel underneath. I want to, this is not stretched paper, I want to stop puddles forming under my paper, which will then keep the edges of the paper too wet, making the wetness of the paper uneven. When that happens, then the water travels unevenly, and you don't really want that to happen. You always want to keep the water on the paper nice and even. So you see, I'm just gently mopping these this edge, and because my paper is very wet at the moment, the colours are continuing to move, which is fine. But I'm just going to lift them off again. And now I'll actually just pick my paper up and just move this paint around just a little bit more. I just want to bring it down a little bit. Our layers within the portrait are all going to be yellow, so that's why it doesn't really matter too much for the portrait to take on some yellow tones. Okay, so the next layer that I'm going to put on again is very much for the background. You might be able to see at the moment that my painting has done a curve like this. It's because I've had it drying in the sun. It's okay to dry your painting in the sun, but you need to make sure that the whole painting's in the sun and not just a part of it, otherwise it will dry unevenly. When I wet this down it will flatten out, so I'm not bothered about the fact that it's curled up a bit. So I'm wetting the whole thing again, and this time what I'm going to do is run some yellow, varying shades of yellow into the portrait itself, but not where there are highlights. So you're looking for a nice even layer of water. And I'm just going to dry my brush, and just to speed things up, I'm just going to take out a bit of water from the portrait, and then I'm just going to continue wetting around. So what I'm trying to avoid here is to have a big puddle of water flooding through his face, because that will make the pigment travel. When we look at the portrait, we can see that this is a very distinctive highlight just here, and then there's another one on his nose and another one on his face here. But this side of his face hasn't got any big highlights on it. I mean, that's a piece of his face that's not in the shadow, but it's not a highlight like here. So I'm now going to be happy to run some yellow sort of around this side of his face, certainly down here. Look how dark this is. So first of all, I'm going to mix up more Carolyn yellow, and I know that I can run this yellow through this part of his body because it's very much in shadow, and I can very much run it through this area here. This ear is all in shadow. Again, I'm just going to retain some white areas of paper. I don't want to cover the whole thing in a block of yellow. So the purpose of running the yellow into him at this point, it's so that we're always merging our background with our portrait. The reason why we're doing that is so that we don't get a build-up of pigment between the outline of Woody and the background. We want to make it all look very seamless. So I'm just going to run that yellow through here. I like to see undertones coming through in a painting as well. I think that's very interesting. And then I'll mix up a bit of Indian yellow, and it might be in the next layer that I'll start adding some Indian yellow to the portrait itself. I can see that the shine is just starting to go off my paper in places, so I can't work this anymore. I'm going to continue on now that my paper is dry. I'm going to put another wash over the whole painting, but I'm going to do it in a little bit more of a considered way this time. I'm going to start paying a lot of attention to the highlights. If you look at the coloured photo, the highlights are very easy to see. The tonal changes are also easy to see on here, but if you're struggling to understand tonal changes in your photo, sometimes it's a good idea to work with a black and white photo. Then you're not confused by colour. You can see quite clearly tonal changes here. I've actually painted quite a few paintings in colour from a black and white photograph just by using the tonal values. But for now, what we're going to do is wet our paper again, but this time I'm going to wet the face separately, and I'm not going to use so much water. And then when I re-wet, I'm going to be careful to not wet these highlights. So we're going to start again by wetting our paper. This yellow background that I've got on here so far won't lift off. It's there for good. I'm going to wet into the portrait, but only on the shadow side. this brush carries a huge amount of water, and I don't want to flood my portrait this time. I want to work in a bit more of a controlled way. So for now I just need to make the layer of water on the background even, and then within the face itself I'm going to use less water. I'll wet the whole thing initially, wetting out into the background. This is just a variation on what we've already done. Now as I wait for that water to sink in, I'm going to mix some more yellow, same yellows, and this time I'm going to add some very pale green, but I'm just only going to add it around the edge of the painting. I'm not going to put it near the face, and I'm just going to use a very, very pale amount of sap green. The white areas of paper that I've got, I'm going to leave. A bit more Indian yellow mixed as well. But now just returning to the painting, as that layer of water seeps in, I'm just going to wet again in the same way around the portrait this time. And then with my smaller brush, this is my Da Vinci Casaneo number 12, which is wet but dripping wet. I'm just going to wet the face again, but I'm not going to wet those highlighted areas. And then I'll pick up a bit of Orolin yellow, and I'll just, while I've got the right amount of wetness on my portrait itself, I'm just going to drop a bit of Orolin yellow into the portrait, and I'm going to drop it where the tones dictate, so I know I can go reasonably dark here on the right hand side. So you see, I can be reasonably specific about where the paint goes, putting up those tonal values, and if some of it seeps into the background, I don't mind. I'm not using lots of water on my brush. And then I'm just going to keep a little eye on that while I drop some more pigment on my background. It's just started to dry there, so I'm just wetting that off again. And then I'll drop a bit more Orolin yellow in places where I already had it. For example, up there and around here. And then Indian yellow, no need to dry and rinse my brush between yellows. And so at the moment what you can see is that the background and the facial portrait are all part of one painting. Now let's drop in a little bit of green, and I'll drop that over both dark and light yellows to get some contrast. I'm not putting the green near the portrait. We'll get varying shades of green by doing this, putting it over Indian yellow and Orolin yellow, and in some places over white paper. Move it around a little bit. I can't really work on the rest of it, it's just got too dry, so I need to leave it there. I'm now going to continue to repeat that, building up the tones of the background and the portrait in the same manner. If you end up getting pigment in the hair area, just lift it out with an almost dry brush. And if you do get paint into your highlight areas, just lift them out. So how dark we can go is determined by the lightest. I'm not talking about highlights here because they're very light, but the lightest tones here, it's really you know, these tones through here are some of the lightest. And that's how, that if we take the whole painting apart from the highlights that dark, we know we won't be making any mistakes. So we're playing it very safe by just building up these yellows at the moment. So I'm going to continue to build those layers up. So with that layer that I've just put on, you can see I'm starting to build up a richer and more colourful background, still just using Orolin yellow, Indian yellow and sap green, still leaving areas of white paper just for interest. It just gives me options later on in the painting. But for now I want to work a little bit more on the face. And there's a couple of ways that I do that. Either I work on a big section of face or I work in smaller sections. When you look into the hairline, you do see skin tones within the hairs, so you don't want to stop with a hard line around the edge of the face. So for that first layer of water, wet evenly over the whole face. Again, this is a reminder that if your pencil lines are heavy, before you wet your paper you might want to try and reduce them down. My pencil lines are borderline. They probably should be just a little bit lighter, but I fear that if I rub mine out anymore the camera won't pick them up at all. So I'm wetting the whole body evenly. Careful to stay within the pencil lines. I'm using my Da Vinci Casaneo number 12 cat's tongue brush, which I use for just about everything these days. When we work in smaller areas on the face I'll use a smaller brush, but for this initial wetting this is a very good brush. It gets into some pretty tight spots. But to get around his face with that even layer of water, I am going to just pick up a couple of other brushes. I'm just going to work with a couple of other brushes. This one, which has a very flared end on it when it's dry, but becomes very beautifully pointed when it's wet, is an Isobe number 4. It's a 6222 series brush. That's for very fine detail. And then this one is another Da Vinci Maestro number 5. These brushes are very versatile, and I've had them all for years. They really do the distance. And I just use a smaller brush just to get right up to the edge. With the next layer of water, I'm just going to drop in more tonal change using Orolin yellow at this stage. So now I'm just waiting for the shine to go off the painting before I add my next layer of water. My next layer of water will be more targeted. I'm not working with a soaking wet brush. It's wet. If I flick it hard, drops will come out, but it's not dripping wet. And you know, it's important how much water you have on your brush. Your painting and in your paint is all important. So I'm just wetting the face again, and this time I'm just not wetting near the highlights. So I've got my Orolin yellow mixed. It's it's not a very thin mix this time. It's got a little bit more pigment in it, and my brush is nicely loaded with it, and I'm just going to drop it in the darker areas. So we're only focused on tonal change at the moment, not colour change, working around the highlights, but we do need to take the yellow over onto the more light side of the face. It is still a rich pink facial tone, so we do still want to have our yellow under there. And then there are certain areas like down here through the neck where the skin is darker, and in this shoulder area and in this shadow area over here it's all much darker, and I can drop just a little bit more Indian yellow onto that shadow side, and I'm just moving the pigment to wherever there is not a highlight, and then I can pick up just a little bit of Indian yellow to emphasize some areas that are clearly in a very dark shadow color. And my paper is still nice and damp. My brush isn't flooded. I can already see quite a lot of tonal change starting to happen already, and this is just using very light yellow. Next layer I'm going to repeat this, but I'm going to repeat it with some more sort of fleshy toned colour. Got some shadows over here, just keeping an eye on the highlights, making sure that no pigment encroaches in where I don't want it. I want this pigment to go exactly where I want it to go. And I've got the control because my paper is the right dampness, and I haven't got too much water and pigment on my brush. As soon as my paper starts to dry, I won't be able to work it anymore. Still got a little bit of moisture on my paper, so I can still add just a little bit more to the ear, and I'll leave it there. So that's a good first layer of actual facial tonal change. For this layer I'm going to build up some flesh tones. Pretty much through the whole painting, the colours I'm going to be using are going to be Aureolin yellow, maybe a little bit of Indian yellow, alizarin crimson for the pink tones, and maybe at times transparent orange, and for the shadow colour phthalo blue. So these are the kind of colours that I mix. You see there's very little pigment, and there's very little of it. I just mix it up as I go, but it's a variation of those colours. I've already wet my paper and I'm ready to apply those fleshy tones. I'm just going to re-wet on the darker side. That's where I'm going to be predominantly dropping this pigment. And first of all, I'm just going to pick up some tones that are really just alizarin crimson and Aureolin yellow. If you're very nervous to start putting colour on your drawing at this stage, this is a good way to do it. It just breaks you in very gently. I've wet my paper and it's ready for another layer of colour. This time I'm going to repeat building up those skin tones just the way I did in the last layer, but this time I'm going to start adding a little bit of shadow colour. Something a little bit different with this layer. If I hold my painting up very close to the camera, I don't know if you can see around the outline, I'm just starting to get a little bit of a thick line that forms. It always happens in a watercolor when you work with lots of layers, and I don't want that on my portrait. The more layers I put on, the more emphasized that's going to be. So what I'm going to do is, just working with a reasonably damp brush, I'm just going to wet the portrait out into the background. It doesn't really disrupt my layers because of the way I paint, working with wet paper each time. With each layer, all of these colours are embedded, so nothing gets moved, nothing gets washed away. But it's just an important aspect of the painting to keep it soft. My painting is dry and I've redrawn the lines. There were a couple of areas where I was just starting to draw the wrong line. The first one was around this ear and down the face here, and the other one was down the neck here. Those lines were wrong, and if I'd continued on, I would have eventually found it very hard to correct. Also, the hairline comes out just here, and I'm going to start building up a realistic colour. For this stage of the painting, what I want to do is get closer to his real skin tones here, and not including the highlights. I'm looking for the part of the skin that's really the lightest, and it's really this area here. It's more orangey than the face, and so if I paint, apart from the highlights, if I paint the whole of the portrait this sort of colour, which is that colour, I really can't go wrong, because everything else beyond there is darker. See, that's pinker, and then that becomes quite purpley, and that looks almost black, you know, not too dissimilar to the background itself. So lots of darkness through there. So I'm going to aim for this kind of pinkish, and I'm just going to continue using those same paints, alizarin crimson, Orlin yellow, and let's see how that mixes up. I don't want to make him look too pink. I want to keep the skin tones but heading towards a browner colour. I'll pick up a bit of this Indian yellow. That's a very bright colour. And then I'm just going to put in a very small amount of phthalo green, and that will just give me some orangey tones. It's still a very warm colour, and I just wipe that on a piece of kitchen towel just to see how that's going to come out. That's a very nice skin tone. Very, very small amounts of pigment being added, but it's all about colour correction the whole way through the portrait. Keep looking through your spy hole and seeing where all those different coloured changes are. I've re-wet around the highlights, and I'm ready to drop a bit more of this more realistic pigment in. I'm going to drop it in with a smaller brush this time. This is my number 5 Da Vinci. Just picking up some of the purple that I had mixed from the layer before, and I'm just painting it into some of the areas where I can see a great deal of shadow. So I'm just may as well capture that while I'm working through. Then back to my warmer, pinker tones. You can see I've spilt my paint just here onto the painting. If you do something like that, the best way to get rid of it is to wash it off with a wet brush. See, it just washes out. If you dab something like that, a little mistake like that, then it will immediately dry in that place, and it will be very hard to move it. So in terms of working on the portrait as a whole, I think I've taken it almost as far as I can. What I'm going to do now is just start working on individual areas, and that will give me much more control. So start working on my painting in independent areas, I really need to mix enough paint so that I can work all of those areas independently with the same mixed palette. So all the shadow colours, wherever there are some, are the same. All the pinky skin tones are the same, and so on. So I'm just going to mix some paints now, and I thought I would just mix them with the camera running so you can see how I do it. Woody's got 3 main skin colours within this photograph. He's got an orangey skin tone that's in the sun, a redder skin tone that's in the sun, and then a much more purpley skin tone that's in the shadow. So I've got a little puddle of water in my well, and I'm just going to mix up this skin tone here. And of course you have to consider that you've got skin tone layers on the painting already, and they're going to influence the colour that these colours will make. The orangey skin tone that I see here is Carolyn yellow, alizarin crimson in, just to see what it does. I don't want to make it too orange. But it's a pinker tone than that. That's not bad. And then there's the redder tones, which are on this cheek and on the forehead. And for that, I can see that the base is alizarin crimson. And then to make that colour, I'm going to try and add a little bit of transparent orange to that. And that's giving me a very glowing apricot. And I see more brown in that skin tone than that, so I'm going to add a little bit more alizarin crimson, and then pick up a tiny amount of phthalo green. You have to be careful working with green and red. If you get the mix wrong, you can just end up with a very muddy colour, but that's quite nice. And then the other colour, so that's going to be quite a mix of alizarin crimson. I definitely see pink in there, and then I see a bit of orange. So that's what we just did with our warmer skin tone. A little bit more orange, orangey pink. That's very, very warm. But then what I need to do with this one is cool it right down, and I'm going to do that with phthalo blue. And you just need to keep working these colours until you get something that resembles the skin tones that you can see through your little spy hole. So look at those 3 colours there. They really do range from being very, very warm to cooler and browner to an almost purpley chocolatey colour. With my dry painting, the first area that I'm going to work in just to test these colours out is the ear on the light side, because that's pretty much got all of those tones in it. So I'm just going to wet that. Wet the whole ear, going slightly up into the hair. So I'm going to wet the ear, and then I'm just going to wait for it to dry. And then so while that's drying, I'm going to wet the other ear, and I'm just going to work on both ears at the same time. And this is often the way I work with a portrait. I just flick between different areas and just keep going. My more orangey red, and put that down here on the lobe. And I'll just work away at this ear now. You can see there's a lot of detail, a lot of shape starting to emerge. I'm going to try and work through the eyes a little bit more this time. I haven't paid much attention to the eyes. I've been wanting to sort of see the character of the portrait develop. I've done a line correction here as well. I'd ended up going out a little bit too far and it was starting to look wrong. So I've fixed that up using my transfer paper template. One of those situations where it's just priceless, that transfer paper. Just going to continue working with the same methodology that I have before. Working with a very small brush around the eyes, just wanting to get that area right. I'm not using very dark shadow line here because I don't want to make it all look too heavy. Some shadow is required. Just going over this line here just to soften it up. In the last layer of paint, I built up these layers quite nicely, and I've got some very nice tonal changes happening now. But I made a mistake in the last layer, which I had to let dry, and that's with the forehead. I was building up this shadow very nicely and nice pinks over here around the highlight, but then I made a mistake in here. I put pigment in when it was too dry, and what's happened is that this is now dark, this is orangey, this is darker, and it makes his forehead look like it's got a dip in the middle. So you've got to keep an eye on those tonal values. If they are wrong, then they can make something that's supposed to be protruding look like it's concave. And that's really the power of painting with watercolor, how those tonal changes can make that difference. So if you get it right, you get some fantastic results, but if you get it wrong, well, then it can all look a bit odd. I'm just gonna fix that up by building up this area again. Very subtle little dimple here. So I'm just going to paint the eyes in, and they really are very dark in the photograph. Woody's actually got brilliant blue eyes, very striking blue eyes. So I'm just gonna suggest that blue, and that's interesting because with that blue in there, I can then see just so clearly of how much darker I've got to make the eyelids. It's interesting with putting in all this colour, it's just all relative. You work in one area and you realise you've got a lot of work to do in another. I suppose that by using the scrubbing brush, which is just a sort of a fluffy end, it's another cat's tongue, it's another Da Vinci, it's a number 6 Nova synthetic. It's just a cheap, very cheap brush. But because it's just got a fluffy little cat's tongue end, I can just be very gentle with my lines. And I'll just emphasize the shape of this eye over here. You've got to be careful working on these dark, very dark areas at this stage. The key is to not put heavy pigment in at this stage. The corner of the mouth is important to get right. Now those eyes are, with that area, I almost just want to be suggestive. Draw in his teeth a little better. The teeth are brightest at the front, and then as they go back into the mouth, they fade into the shadow of the mouth. So you need to capture that. but also these teeth, because of the way the light comes in, there's a shadow line on them there, and I want to capture that. So I'm going to go ahead and wet this mouth area again. Woody has got such a big smile. I can really see Woody's character coming through. It's lovely to see. It's nice highlight work through here. There's a couple of things I want to do. First of all, I need to keep working the mouth and defining the shadows now that it's dry. Just drawing such a fine line between the teeth. You can absolutely ruin a portrait if you get that wrong. I do want to work on the background just a little bit. There's a bit of a blemish here where the skin colour ran, and there's a little bit of a mistake here. And by taking some green background colour into that up to the skin line, I'll hide those two areas. And I just want to even out the colour because it's very light around his head and then darker at the edges, and I just want to even that up, but I want to retain some white paper. I don't think I'm going to take it very much darker. Making a few corrections around the mouth. So for the background, I'm going to mix up some more sap green. But I'm gonna mix up a slightly different shade of it. I'm gonna put in a little bit of a little bit of apatite green. Now that's got a very deep green in it, so be warned about dropping that in. Okay, now with the background, I can work on that separately to the face, so I'll just get my water. So I've mixed an apatite green that had a bit of sap green in it, and I've also mixed up a sap green with a bit of Indian yellow. And I'm going to wet my paper. I'm going to wet slightly into the hairline, but I don't want to take my background water into the portrait now. I think that last background colour that went on was really nice, and I'm thinking that the painting is just looking so beautiful. I just want to work on his hair, and the paint that I use for hair is these Coliro by Fine Tech I've got lots and lots of these paints. They're made in Germany and they come in these beautiful little pans, and the metallics are just so beautiful. They are watercolors. So I'm going to use these very lightly just to build the two tones through his hair. There's grey and silver, very light in places. I mean, where it's white, it's really the light catching it. And then there's grey areas too, so I'm going to try and capture all of that. I'm going to apply these Coliros with my cat's tongue brush, my little one that I use for scrubbing. This one here, the Da Vinci number 6. So I'm going to put some light tones first. You just use them straight from the pans. And if I just hold up that silver that I've just put on so the camera can pick it up, hopefully. The last thing that I want to work on this portrait of Woody is a little bit more problematic, and it's problematic for two reasons. So if you're new to portraiture and you're at the end of your portrait and you're happy with it and you're thinking, well, I don't really want to touch it anymore, then don't. Just leave it as it is and just accept that you're happy with it. I've got lots of experience of working with portraiture, and only for that reason I'm going to give this a bit of a go. And the area that I want to fix up is the shadow side of his face. And I don't want to take the colours that dark on my portrait because I think they'd look out of place. And in fact, the light side of my portrait is lighter. Like his skin tones on his lit side are a beautiful kind of pale strawberry colour, and on mine they're more yellow. But I think that colour works on this portrait, and I don't want to touch it. I think it's warm and realistic and beautiful. But there's not a big enough contrast between the lit side and the shadow side. So that's really what I'm wanting to adjust. So it's problematic because I'm going to be working with some dark staining pigment, and the other reason why it's problematic is because I've already painted the hair in, and that could move. This paper is so remarkable that it can take all of this work, layer after layer of pigment. I have worked with Fabriano paper as well, and that's also excellent paper. And then determine whether I need to do that again, but that's looking much better. This is my finishing touches now. I'm not going to touch the painting anymore after this. But what I want to do is soften the hairline around Woody's face. Okay, now the other thing that I want to do before I call this finish, there's two things. I'm gonna repeat what I just did with that shadow line, and I'm gonna darken the dark areas. Little enhanced areas, but it does quite a lot to create definition. Very happy with it. I hope that you have success with your own portrait, and I hope that you've learned something.